Using clusters, paintings, and trees to find your common ancestors, Part 2. In Part 1, we looked at the different types of clusters, and we found one in particular that we were going to study in more detail. In Part 2, we'll look at my family to find some more details about my great-grandparents. We'll examine the segment data from the cluster, and we'll then run AutoKinship on the cluster to see what kind of connections we might be able to determine there. Two of my paternal second cousins have tested. One of these is on my dad's paternal side, the Barry side, and the other is on his maternal side, the Burns side. Today we're looking specifically at Thomas Burns and Bridget Mary Fenton's line in my family. Thomas and Bridget had 6 children, but only 3 of them grew to adulthood, married, and had children of their own. I have a couple of second cousins here. My cousin Trish, who has given me permission to use her real name, and I have both tested. My cousin that I'm calling Stan, that's not his real name, has not tested, but hopefully he will in the future. It would be very nice to have one grandchild from each of Thomas and Bridget's daughters tested. Looking at Thomas and Bridget's families a bit more, Thomas was from County Roscommon, Ireland. His parents were Patrick Burns and Honora Shannon. Bridget was from County Limerick in Ireland, and her parents were John Fenton and Joanna O'Brien. We also know her paternal grandparents, William Fenton and Bridget Lillis. Thomas and Bridget met and married in Virginia. It's unlikely that the families knew each other in Ireland, partly because of the distance between County Roscommon and County Limerick, but also because Thomas was about 13 years older than Bridget. So we had picked this MyHeritage cluster in Part 1, particularly the red cluster 1 in here to explore in more details. My cousin Trish is in cluster 6, the blue one that I have put a square around, and she has a number of gray cells to cluster 1. I've underlined the gray cells with the dotted red line, and that means that the gray cells indicate that she matches people in that cluster as well. So looking at cluster 1 in more detail, Joe Smith is the name I'm using for the match of interest here. It's not his real name. And I've given pseudonames to all the other people in the cluster so we can examine the cluster in more detail. His mother's maiden name was O'Brien, and she grew up in County Limerick. Well, we already know that my second great-grandmother, Joanna O'Brien, was from County Limerick. And so Joe and I have assumed for several years now that our match has to be on his mother's O'Brien side. So now let's look at a little more details of my family. My third cousin, once removed, published a book in 1955 about the Fenton family from County Limerick, Ireland. And this was on the 100th anniversary of the death of William Fenton, who was my third great-grandfather. Now, his son John, my second great-grandfather, was the father of Bridget. My dad provided a lot of the information about John Fenton's descendants for the family book. And I have all of my dad's notes and trees. This is one page of them here. Here's a picture of Bridget Fenton as an adult. According to the book, John Fenton and wife Joanna O'Brien immigrated to the United States shortly after the birth of their daughter Bridget. But now with the internet, there's so many more records available online than anything that my dad could find in 1955. I found the 1860 U.S. Census, and it lists John's family in Petersburg, Virginia, and says that Bridget is 7 years old. John's family went to Petersburg because several of his siblings had already gone there. But now, having an approximate birth year for Bridget, 1853, and her parents' names that I already knew, I can look for her baptismal records in Limerick. So here's a map of Ireland indicating the location of County Limerick. Both Find My Past and Roots Ireland have Catholic baptismal and marriage record indices. The scanned images from the individual parishes are at the National Library of Ireland. They don't have an index there, and you can do a finger search to look for a record. But using the Find My Past or Roots Ireland index makes it so much easier because you can get an exact date to start with. So John and Joanna married in November of 1852 at the Bruff Catholic Parish. And here's their wedding information from the Bruff Parish that's been uploaded to the National Library of Ireland. Bridget was baptized in September of 1853 at the Balgadin Catholic Church. I have located on the map of Limerick where the marriage occurred and where the baptism occurred, and the location's about 7.6 kilometers apart. It's likely that Joanna's family lived somewhere near where the marriage occurred, and that would be where she had grown up. And then after the marriage, John and Joanna moved a little bit south into the parish where Bridget was baptized. One important aspect of looking at genealogy and trying to find more information about your family is looking at their friends, associates, and neighbors, the fan club, and particularly baptismal sponsors and marriage witnesses. In a lot of cases, they would be very close family members. One of Bridget's godparents was Joanna Coffey, and the name Coffey jumped at me as I have several DNA matches who had someone with that surname in their trees. So I went searching for other Coffeys at the Balgadin Parish. I found that Catherine Coffey married Mike O'Brien just a few years earlier than my Bridget's baptism. So then I searched for baptisms for their children and found they had 8 children. So this seemed to be another indication of the probable link to Joe's family on the O'Brien line, finding all these O'Briens located here. At this point, I didn't know which, if any of these, was worth following up on, so I put that aside and came back to it later on, as you'll see. Going back to Cluster 1, Joe's family is in County Limerick, Ireland. His mother's maiden name is O'Brien. My second great-grandmother was an O'Brien, and I'm finding all these O'Brien connections, so it still seems like quite possible that Joe and I had been correct that his mother's line was where we had our match. However, looking at the cluster and looking at the MyHeritage profiles that people in this cluster had provided of their information, I found that Sue and Sarah's mothers both had a maiden name of Smith. So that tells me that this cluster has to be on Joe's paternal side, which is not at all what we expected, and that Trish and I must match him on the paternal side. Next, I took the HTML file for the auto cluster and put it into DNA Painter's Cluster Auto Painter. First, you select the gender of the test taker and you select the HTML file for the auto painter. Since it's a MyHeritage HTML file, and those files for MyHeritage do not include the DNA segment data, I had to go to MyHeritage and export the segment data, convert it from the zip file that they send to you into a CSV file, and then add that to my Cluster Auto Painter. So here we have 184 segments that have been found that are over 7 centimorgans, and they're in 19 clusters. And here's the cluster, the 19 clusters from the MyHeritage auto cluster that I had run earlier. We're particularly interested in cluster 1 because that's the one that has Joe in it. And so here's cluster 1 and all the people that are shown in cluster 1. Now Joe Smith triangulates with me and Sarah and Sue on chromosome 7. He also matches me on chromosome 10. And we know that Sarah and Sue both had Smith as surname in their family. They also match me, Sue and Sarah and Frank. Frank is the son of Sue, on chromosome 8. So then I look to see where my cousin Trish comes in. And here's cousin Trish. She's shown here in red. And she triangulates with Joe, Sue, Sarah, and me on cluster 7. And she also triangulates with Sue, Sarah, Frank, and me on cluster 8. She's also on cluster 10, but there's only a small overlap with Joe. It's about 4 centimorgans, and that's not enough for MyHeritage to consider it a match. So at this point, it appears certainly that chromosome 7 matches and chromosome 8 matches are on a Smith line. We don't know where that goes yet, but we've gotten that far. So next we're going to see what we can do with that. We're going to look at the AutoKinship. That's run on Genetic Affairs, and you can run it for any set of data that has not only how much you share with a DNA match, but how much the shared matches shared with each other. So in this case, that would be MyHeritage, 23andMe, or GEDmatch. They're the only sites that give that information. So I used the data from cluster 1 from MyHeritage, and I added Trish's data to it. Because I'm running the manual AutoKinship function, I can use a WADO, what are the odds, tree from DNA Painter to that, and that is useful in that I know exactly how Trish and I are related, so adding that information takes away any confusion from what might occur in AutoKinship. So here I have our families back to Bridget, how much DNA Trish and I share, and I have to put in our names exactly as they appear on MyHeritage so that they are picked up by AutoKinship as being the exact same people that are in the MyHeritage file. So here's the result for cluster 1. It's kind of busy, and we'll look at some parts of this in more detail. So here we have close family around Joe. We know that Frank is the son of Sue. He indicated that in MyHeritage, and that Sue's maiden name was Smith. This suggests that Joe and Sue are first cousins. We also know that Sarah indicated her mother's maiden name was Smith, and this suggests that Sarah and Joe are second cousins. I have not talked to Joe about this. I don't know if that's correct or not, but it has occurred in several other runs that I have done comparing this cluster or other clusters related to Joe. This suggests that Joe is at a grandparent's level to Trish and me, and that seems unlikely as Joe is around the same age as both Trish and I. And also, we're pretty sure that there's more than one line of match to Joe's family. It certainly looks from this cluster that we match his paternal Smith side, and we have not ruled out the possibility that we still match his mother's O'Brien side. So in summary, we examined my family in more detail, and then we looked at the cluster containing Joe Smith and his matches. We found that the match in these cluster is on Joe's paternal side, and that's not at all what Joe and I had expected from our earlier discussions. We found which segments these matches shared with me and Trish, as well as looking at AutoKinship for possible connections. In part 3, we're going to build out Joe's tree and see if we can find the connection to his paternal side by using the Irish records to back up the family in more detail. Any questions? You can contact me at patriciacolemangenealogy.com. You can also find me on Facebook. I'm a moderator at the DNA Painter group and a moderator at the Genetic Affairs user group.